Northern Virginia House of Prayer merged with us in 2017, and they're not exactly a satellite of the Kansas City House of Prayer, but they've been connected with the Kansas City group from the beginning, and two of their guys from their leadership are going to be here this weekend, Friday night, 7 o'clock in this room, and then Sunday morning. So join us for those services if you can. I'll be at the Gates service on Saturday night. Jim, I'll see you over there probably at the gate because I know you go to those. But the guys from Kansas City, it should be an interesting time to have them with us. All right, Book of Numbers. Tonight we are in the Book of Numbers, and it is every bit of appropriate that it's called Numbers. Traditionally, it's called Numbers because of the two census that were taken in chapter 1 and chapter 26. Two different censuses taken 40 years apart. And interestingly, when we get to them in due season, you'll find they were almost identical. The numbers that were counted 40 years apart. It's kind of fascinating. But there's a lot more reason to call it Numbers, frankly. I was joking before we started the class tonight that I love numbers. And I'm talking about math. I love math. And the book of Numbers is full of counting. There are tons of counts of things, and there's a lot of lists. I'm not going to go, repetitively. Some things are listed, like one of the things tonight that's listed 12 times is the 12 tribes had 12 tribal leaders, and the leaders individually gave the same offering 12 times, and it's listed exactly 12 times, 12 times, 12 times, and you go through it. But the specificity that the Lord felt led to include on this stuff is fascinating. So the book of Numbers is a little unusual in that regard. How you doing? Good. And so Moses, of course, is the traditional author. The writing is somewhere between 1446, 1406 BC, traditional dating. The original recipients were the Jewish people coming out of slavery in Egypt. And so the religion of Judaism was just being laid down and codified at this point. It's a historical narrative, and the book of Numbers contains the story of the Exodus wandering. Not just the trip to Mount Sinai that was covered in the book of Exodus, but the wandering in the wilderness, the wandering in the desert for the 40 years, or in point of fact, 38 years. And so it has the reason why the group was not initially able to enter into the promised land. And that's given in some detail, and we'll cover that in the course of this study. So this book also gives us more details on Joshua and Caleb and the 12 tribes. I think the 12 tribes, the duties and the location and placement of the 12 tribes is interesting to me, and perhaps it'll be interesting to you as well. Now notice on your notes under key verses, in Exodus chapter 40, verse 17, we read, "So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year after they came out of Egypt." Everybody see that? First day, first month, second year. In Numbers 10, they leave Mount Sinai finally. So between Exodus 40 and Numbers 10, they're at the same location. On the 10th day of the second month in the second year, so first day of the first month, second year, 10th day of the second month, they march out. And so the whole time for the book of Exodus, the majority of it is placed at that camp. All of Leviticus is placed in that timing. And the book of Numbers up till chapter 10 are at the foot of Mount Sinai. And I mentioned these two census are the basis for the naming of the book as Numbers. So Numbers chapter 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year. And so this is roughly a month after the tabernacle was raised in Exodus 40. And he said, "Take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name one by one." So this specificity, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I really love the accuracy and the care that was taken to record everything. This specificity is one of the things that fascinates me about the Bible. Like, who cares how many donkeys and mules and so forth there were? But apparently the Lord takes note of that. And these people's names that are one-offs that are mentioned It's as if the Lord wanted to record historically that they had a part to play, and eternally it makes sense. But in the natural, it seems like overkill with details. Verse 3, you and Aaron are to count according to the divisions all the men in Israel who are 20 years old or more and able to serve in the army. So let's pause right there. The census only involved men, and only men who were 20 years old or older, and that was the second qualification. The third qualification was they were able to serve in the army. So there was no condition that would prohibit them from military service, illness or whatever. And so the number that they're eventually going to come to does not include the men outside of those parameters, men under 20 years old, men over, say, 60, pick an age that you don't feel like they're eligible for war. It doesn't include females. It doesn't include all the children. And so the general thought is at this point, the group of Israel that came out of Egypt was somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people. But those are not the ones that are going to be counted. Just the men that are eligible for war. The ones that are able to fight are going to be counted. I know you came in a few minutes late. I'm dealing with a bad cold, so if I have to eat mints and drink water and all that, that's what's going on. So the Lord assigns a helper from each tribe, and I'm going to skip the naming of each of the helpers, but they're recorded in this first chapter if you're interested. And then in verse 17, Moses and Aaron took these men whose name had been specified, and they called the whole community together the first day of the second month. And so they immediately responded. This is the same day as the first verse of this chapter. So the same day. The people registered their ancestry by clans and families, and the men 20 years old or more were listed by name one by one as the Lord commanded Moses. And so he counted them in the desert of Sinai. And as I mentioned, no irony intended. There's a lot of counting in the book of Numbers. So in verse 20, from the descendants of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, all the men 20 years old or more who were able to serve in the army were listed by name, one by one, according to the records of their clans and families. And the number from the tribe of Reuben was 46,500. And this happens 12 times, so I'm not going to repeat it 12 times with all the different tribes. And the census results in verse 45, the Israelites 20 years old or more who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families. The total number was 603,550. And so this number, interestingly enough, as I mentioned, the book is called Numbers primarily because of the two census 40 years apart. This same number is going to be present, roughly the same number, 40 years later, even though that whole generation is going to die out in the wilderness. And so they're going to be not multiplied, but replicated in the course of time. In verse 47, the ancestral tribe of the Levites, however, was not counted with the others. So the census didn't include them because the Levites were not part of the warriors, and the Levites were to be distributed among the tribes for the Lord's purposes. Essentially the chaplains of the day, I guess, if they were in war. The Lord had said to Moses, you must not count the tribe of Levi or include them in the census of the other Israelites. Instead, appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle of the covenant law. Over all of its furnishings and everything belonging to it, they are to carry the tabernacle and all of its furnishings. They are to take care of it and encamp round about it. And so that was their primary duty at this point in Israel's history, was the transportation and the function of the tabernacle of Moses. And then chapter 2, the arranging of the tribes. Now, think about this yourself. You got, say, 2.5, 3 million people, and you're going to march from place to place, day to day, and you don't know where you're going. You don't know how to organize it and so forth. And so some type of organizational structure. I don't know in recorded history another group of 2.5 or 3 million people marching collectively from point A to point B over a long period of time, 40 years. And so this organization had to be pretty concise. You could get lost in a crowd of 3 million people. You're never going to find your family, or your whatever. And so the organization was very concise. In verse 1 of chapter 2, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron,
The Israelites are to encamp round about the tent of meeting, some distance from it, each of them under their own standard and holding the banner of their families. And so most of us have seen banners at one time or another, but the idea was there were flags that you could see from a distance representing the tribes. And certain tribes were more key than others. There were 4 key tribes that were the positioning for the other tribes. And the family group would know to rally to the major standard, the real tall one. And then within the tall standard or banner, there were lower banners of individual clans and families. And so this idea of, sometimes you see in churches, it's more in the past than presently, people using banners. Well, the banners were used to signal the location of your people. They were also used for some other signaling, but primarily they were the standards for assembling and the standards to march under, that you would stay with your group, essentially. So it was an organizational tool. In verse 3, on the east toward the sunrise, the divisions of the camp of Judah are to encamp under their standard, and the leader of Judah, da-da-da-da-da. Now, under each of these 4 groups, these 4 different sections, east, west, south, etc., the first one that's mentioned, if you read the text very carefully, and I have, it seems to indicate that the standard of the first one is the standard for all 3 of them collectively, because the standard is mentioned for the first one if you study it carefully. So like in the case of Judah, under their standard, but then when you read immediately with them are Issachar and Zebulun on either side of Judah, their standards are not mentioned. And so the preeminent standard bearer for that threesome was Judah. Same thing with Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Reuben was the principal player. He was on the right side, their group. In the middle was the tabernacle, surrounded by the Levites, and the Levites, I'm sure, had their own standard. It says they did in verse 17. In the rear were Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, and Ephraim's standard is mentioned in the text. And then on the left, Dan's standard is mentioned along with Asher and Naphtali. And so this group of the 12, the 13th tribe being the Levites in the middle. So the composition of 13 verses 12 includes Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 sons of Joseph, rather than just calling them collectively Joseph. So everything was done exactly as the Lord required. Verse 32, these are the Israelites counted according to their families, all the men in the camps by their division, number 603,550. The Levites, however, were not counted along with the other Israelites as the Lord commanded Moses. So the Israelites did everything the Lord commanded Moses, and that's the way they encamped under their standards. That's the way they set out. And so this same configuration of who was next to who's in front, who's to the left, who's to the right, they maintained this marching. Now, you can picture it in your own mind. I don't think it was like we see soldiers on a parade ground. I don't think it was like concise steps. Everybody's lined up exactly 3 feet apart or whatever. I think it was in more of a group thing than that. And yet, it was pretty concise, Amazing, really, for the organizational aspect of it. Chapter 3. So the Levites were assigned with all the tabernacle duties. Excuse the mint. This is the account, verse 1. This is the account of the family of Aaron and Moses at the time the Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. The names of the son of Aaron were Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, and Eleazar and Ithamar. And Nadab and Abihu were the 2 that were killed when the fire of the Lord came out and consumed them when they offered strange fire. You may recall from Leviticus when we're studying that. Eleazar and Ithamar are going to become the principal priests in support of their father Aaron. And these 2 men will actually enter into the promised land. Both of them become more and more key figures as we go through the text. Verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, bring the tribe of Levi and present them to Aaron the priest to assist him. They are to perform duties for him and for the whole community at the tent of meeting by doing the work of the tabernacle. They are to take care of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, fulfilling the obligations of the Israelites by doing the work of the tabernacle. Give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are the Israelites who will be given wholly to him. Appoint Aaron and his sons to serve as priests, and anyone else who approaches the sanctuary is to be put to death. The word priest, by the way, is kohen. Interestingly, Jewish people doing genetic research have found that a lot of the people with the last name Cohen are descended from the tribe of Levi. And so that name somehow survived down through all the ages, indicative of a priestly lineage of some sort. That was the first genetic studies they did on the Jewish people, in fact, to trace the Levites. Anyway, verse 12, I've taken the Levites from among the Israelites in place of all the firstborn offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine, for all the firstborn are mine. When I struck down the firstborn of Egypt, I set apart for myself every firstborn in Israel, whether human or animal. They are to be mine. I'm the Lord. And so this prophetic act of choosing the Levites within the Jews as firstborn sons is fascinating, because the Lord also said that the Jews were his firstborn son. And so within greater humanity, the Jews are the firstborn son in the earth. Within the Jews, the Levites are the firstborn, or represent the firstborn sons. And so a higher position or role, if you will, the right of the firstborn is spelled out in various ways in the Old Testament, but essentially they got twice as much inheritance as everybody else. And so they're reserved for the Lord. They're dedicated to the Lord. And verse 14, the Lord said to Moses in the desert of Sinai, count the Levites by their families and clans. Count every male a month old or more. So now think about that count. For the general population of men, it was 20 and older able to fight. Here, counting the Levites, it's every male a month old or more. And so Moses counted them as he was commanded to. Verse 17, these were the names of the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Now, take note of those three names, because the clans within the Levites are going to be referred to a lot, not tonight, but throughout the book of Numbers and into Deuteronomy as well. And so the first son, Gershon, his descendants became the Gershonites. Second son, Kohath, became the Coethites. Merari, the third son, became the Merarites. And so they had different duties. In verse 25, at the tent of meeting, the Gershonites were responsible for the care of the tabernacle and the tent. So that was their principal role. It's covering the curtains, the entrance to the tent of meeting, the curtains of the courtyard, the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard surrounding the tabernacle and altar, the ropes and everything else related to their use. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too glamorous to me. You know, they handled the tent. Okay, great. The Coethites get the good stuff. They were responsible for the care of the sanctuary. They were responsible for the care of the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, the articles of the sanctuary used in ministering, the curtain and everything related to their use. And so the Coethites got the stuff on the inside, the actual sacred articles. Of course, all of it was sacred, but the articles that were used within the tabernacle itself. And then the Merarites were appointed to take care of the frames of the tabernacle. So they got the tent pegs and the posts and all that. Of the three, the Coethites got the best deal. You tracking with me?
I am. I just find it amusing.
You what?
I find it amusing.
I'm fighting here, don't bother me. I had a mild case of pneumonia I'm coming out of, yeah. No, I'm all right, but I'm still wheezy and coughy.
You look fine.
You look marvelous for a half-dead guy.
How do you do?
If I look fine, it's got to be the anointing. I was bound and determined not to pull the plug on this tonight. I'm sorry y'all have to suffer. All right. Verse 38, this is where we left off. I'm still in chapter 3. Moses and Aaron and his sons were to camp to the east of the tabernacle. So they were given specific locations within the camp of where they were to position themselves. Toward the sunrise, in front of the tent of meeting, they were responsible for the care of the sanctuary on behalf of the Israelites. Anyone else who approached the sanctuary was to be put to death. And so this was not for general consumption and hanging out and having a picnic. The census of the Levites eventually found that there were 22,000 Levites that were male, a month old or more. And so that's verse 39 is the data on that. That's an interesting parallel because remember the Lord had said the Levites are going to represent the firstborn sons of Israel. And so they did another count for the firstborn males from all the tribes, verse 40. The Lord said to Moses, count all the firstborn males who are a month old or more and make a list of their names. Take the Levites for me in place of all the firstborn of the Israelites, and the livestock of the Levites in the place of firstborn of the livestock of all the Israelites. The total was 22,273. So approximately the same number. I think that's fascinating. Like I said, I'm a geek with numbers, but I just think it's fascinating. Same number, roughly the same number. So the Lord was symbolically using two groups that were numerically equivalent. I just think that's neat. Chapter 4, priestly duties are assigned by clan. Again, the Coethites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. In verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take a census of the Coethite branch of the Levites. They're listed first this time because they got the good stuff. Take a census. Verse 3, count all the men from 30 to 50 years of age. Take note of that because that's the priestly service range. Who come to serve in the work of the tent of meeting. And then verse 4, this is the work of the Coethites of the tent of meeting, to take care of the most holy things. And then it delineates that. There were 2,750 of them. Now, this room that we're sitting in right now could hold 3 tabernacles of Moses. Not including the courtyard around it, which would have been another 150 by 75 roughly. So it would have been bigger, the courtyard around it. But the tabernacle itself, 3 of them would have fit in this room. Roughly where that column is would be the division all the way across. And so it took 2,750 guys to handle the stuff that was in there. Now think about that for a second. It's a lot of guys. That's a lot of guys. And so this stuff was made out of gold. A lot of it was real serious, heavy stuff. You know, they marched, they did all kinds of things with it. So obviously the same person wasn't always handling the same thing. But there were a lot of men dedicated to the most holy things, is my point. And then the Gershonites, they were to carry the curtains of the tabernacle, the veil, the various covers and so forth. There were 2,630 of them. So in addition to carrying them, of course, they had to erect them and take them down. And then the Merarites had to carry the frames, the posts, the crossbars, and all that other stuff. There were 3,200 of them. And so they had a huge group too. So altogether, we got 8,580 guys carrying the, it's a lot of guys, I know, carrying, remember 3 of them would get in this room. So it seems like overkill, doesn't it? Uh-huh.
It's like an army.
Collectively, none of that stuff is light.
None of it's light, and you don't want to drop any of that when there's a pillar of fire leading you in front of you that said, you know, you dropped that, I saw that, you know, you're toast. That's a paraphrase, but that's a lot of guys. You know, the Lord devoted a lot of caution into it. He didn't give them anything that was impossible. He made it very possible. They were not, I would say, overworked. You know, it wasn't an impossible task that they were assigned. My belief is, as human beings, there was probably a pecking order. You know, among the Coethites, they got the good stuff, as I said. They were probably like, boy, I wish I was a Coethite, get in there with the stuff. And then within the Coethites, well, I get to handle the menorah. Well, that's nothing. I get to handle the Ark of the Covenant. Wow. And so this is camp talk back in ancient Israel. Sorry. Okay, so verse 46. So Moses, Aaron, and the leaders of Israel counted all the Levites by their clans and families. All the men that were 30 to 50 years of age, remember the ones from a month old and up were 22,000, but 30 to 50 who came to do the work of serving and carrying the tent of meeting numbered 8,580 men. So these were the actual guys that could work. At the Lord's command through Moses, each was assigned his work and told what to carry. Thus they were counted as the Lord commanded Moses. We'll come back to the priest in a minute. But the age of the priest, this idea of serving to 50, this changed under King David, as did the priestly duties. The priestly duties assigned by Moses were applicable to the tabernacle in the wilderness. When David moved the Ark of the Covenant away from the tabernacle of Moses to Jerusalem in anticipation of building the temple, the priestly duties changed, as did the age of the priests. And so in practice at the time of David, they moved down to 25 from 30. And this idea of 30 to 50 they were able to minister, there's a number of texts that indicate that they could assist after age 50, but they were not primarily responsible. So it wasn't like age 50, you just go to the back of the 12 tribes and, walk in the dust back there. They were still part of the picture, but they were not principally responsible for the things. All right, chapter 5. This involves a very unusual test for adultery in this chapter. First, there's a reference in the first part about people being unclean in the camp. Verse 2, command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike. Send them outside of the camp so they'll not defile the camp where I dwell among them. Now, this has both societal implications, cultural implications. It has religious implications, and it has health implications. You can't attribute all of these episodes of being ceremonially unclean to potential health problems. But you can attach a lot of them to it. For example, the touching a dead body. If you touch a dead body that died of an infectious disease, the infectious disease transmits. Same thing with certain skin diseases, the leprosy and so forth, the first one we think of. And so the idea of sending them outside the camp was to not defile the camp. You got 3 million people camping out together for 40 years. If you get, I just getting over a mild case of pneumonia. You get somebody sick with COVID, camping with 3 million people, everybody gets the COVID, you follow me, or whatever the disease is. And so there had to be certain rules that were totally unfamiliar to them culturally. This idea of your loved one is sick, they got to go outside the camp. What are you talking about? I'm taking care of them. They're not going outside. Yeah, they got to go outside of the camp. These religious captions and religious intoned prohibitions and regulations definitely had health implications. And so the culture at the time, I'm sure, was resistant to a lot of these things, but it was absolutely necessary, looking back in retrospect. Medical science eventually caught up with the purpose of a lot of it. In verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any man or woman who wrongs another in any way and so is unfaithful to the Lord is guilty. Now take note of that. If you wrong somebody else, you're being unfaithful to the Lord. Remember the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Jesus talked about the two most important things in the scriptures. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the two most important things. So to wrong someone else is being unfaithful to the Lord. Verse 7, they must confess the sin they've committed. They must make full restitution for the wrong they've done and add 1/5 of the value of it and give it all to the person they've wronged. And so restitution plus 20%. You got to make it right plus 20%. And so we have court appointed, we have court personnel that assign damages that are to be paid if you wrong someone. This was the Lord's instructions so that people would be careful to how they treated other people. There was a provision if that person died and they were not able to receive the restitution, verse 8, if that person had no close relative to whom restitution can be made for the wrong, the restitution belongs to the Lord and must be given to the priest. And so this was included as well. The restitution was for the benefit of the person who was repenting, as much as it was for the recipient being made whole. Now, this very mysterious test for adultery. I'll tell you out of the gate, this one is a one-off. It's not explained in Scripture. It's not repeated in detail anywhere else in the Bible. I don't know of anything else parallel to this ritual that I'm about to describe. I'll explain it and then I'll go through the text. And so we got 3 million people. And by the way, have any of you ever been in a tribal situation? I'm talking about not the American Native Americans. I'm talking about real tribal villages. So I've been in probably 100 or more of them. So they're very, very close together. See how those tables are close together? The little mud huts and so forth are that far apart. And so, therefore, if this guy's got a good-looking wife and this guy's right here and he's interested in that woman, that's a problem because they're like right on top of each other. Bathing, sleeping, making marital intimacy, all that stuff happens in close quarters. You follow? So morality is a big premium in a tribal situation. These are not typically immoral people. They're typically very moral because of the exposure. If you're not careful, you'll see things you don't want to see, privacy-wise. You agree? Because of proximity. And so we got 40 years of husbands that had the right to say to a wife, I divorce you without cause in that culture. But the Lord raised the standard and said, oh no, you can't divorce them without cause. You can divorce them for adultery. Well, what if there are no witnesses to the adultery? This is where this weird ritual comes in. And so my caveat to all this was, we got 3 million people with at least 600,000 jealous husbands. This is for wives suspected of adultery, but it also defends the wives because this is a very mystical expose of their adultery. All right, so verse 11. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, so that another man has sexual relations with her, and this is hidden from her husband, and her impurity is undetected, since there is no witness against her, and she's not been caught in the act. So this is just suspicion. And if feelings of jealousy come over her husband, and he suspects his wife, she is impure, or if he's jealous and suspects her, even though she's not impure, then we got the following. Everybody got the picture? Whether she's guilty or innocent, this is the procedure. And so prior to this test, she's just guilty. If the guy said, I'm done with you, I think you cheated on me, end of the story. But this made it different. Verse 16, the priest shall bring her and have her stand before the Lord. Then he shall take some holy water in a clay jar. By the way, quick aside, holy water, water that's been in the laver. This is not the Catholic version of holy water. Holy water is the water that's been used in the laver. Take some holy water in a clay jar and put some dust from the tabernacle floor into the water. After the priest has had the woman stand before the Lord, he shall loosen her hair and place in her hands the remainder offering, the grain offering for jealousy, while he himself holds the bitter water that brings a curse. Now take note of that. So let me just pause for a second. So we got some water dipped out of the laver. Everybody see my water bottle from the laver? And then I'm going to go down to the dirt on the floor of the tabernacle. I'm going to mix that in the water and shake it up, I guess. This is the water now that brings a curse. What makes it that? The fact that the dirt from the tabernacle went into the water. This is the only hocus pocus about it. You follow me? There's no chemicals, there's no incense, there's no stuff to make you sick, unless dirt arbitrarily makes you sick, a little bit of it. But he gets this water, and then verse 19. Then the priest shall make the woman swear an oath. He'll say to her, if no other man has had sexual relations with you, and you've not gone astray and become impure while married to your husband, may this bitter water that brings a curse not harm you. So the first one is positive. This oath, the first part of it's positive. In other words, if you're innocent, this will exonerate you. Verse 20, but if you've gone astray while married to your husband, and you have made yourself impure by having sexual relations with a man other than your husband, and here the priest is to put the woman under this curse. May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry and your abdomen swell. May this water that brings a curse enter into your body so that your abdomen swells or your womb miscarries. Then the woman is to say amen, and the NIV says so be it. It actually says amen twice in Hebrew. So this, would y'all agree this is a very strange test for adultery? I mean, this is not the rape kit they used at the police department. This is something entirely different. And so the result of a positive test is that you're going to lose your baby. This seems to imply that the woman's pregnant, how the thing came to light. And your stomach is going to swell as if you were pregnant. And so it's a very, very strange result. Then, if that were not strange enough, verse 23, the priest is to write these curses on a scroll and then wash them into the bottle of bitter water. And then he makes the woman drink the bitter water that brings a curse. And the bitter suffering will enter her, verse 25. The priest is to take from her hands the grain offering for jealousy, wave it before the Lord, and bring it to the altar. The priest is then to take a handful of grain as an offering, as a memorial offering, and burn it on the altar. After that, he's to have the woman drink the water. And so the result of this incredible deal, the last couple of verses, the first one is if she's guilty, verse 27, if she's made herself impure and been unfaithful to her husband, this will be the result. When she's made to drink the water that brings a curse and causes bitter suffering, it will enter her, her abdomen will swell, and her womb will miscarry, and she'll become a curse. Verse 28, if, however, the woman has not made herself impure, but is clean, she'll be cleared of guilt and will be able to have children. Now, I know we got a lot of material to cover tonight, but I got to talk about this. What do y'all think about this? Is this the most bizarre ritual that you've ever heard from the Bible? From the Bible. I hate to say anything's bizarre from the Bible, but I can't figure this one out. I don't know that this was ever used, to be honest with you. When I was thinking about it, let's say that you're some wife who's been accused of this thing, and you're brought to this court and have to go through this. I'd have faded dead away long before I got to the water. In other words, you're dealing with really serious charges. You're in a public setting, you're accused of adultery. You got to go through all this rigmarole. In your heart, you either know that you're guilty or you know that you're innocent. If you're guilty, you're toast. There's no way you're going to keep a straight face to the bottom line when you drink the water. By then, you're already probably going to be saying, please forgive me, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine anybody going through all this guilty. But even innocent, it would have been difficult to get through of it and keep your composure and so forth. One of the things I didn't comment on, early on, they make the woman take her hair and untie it. They take a position of mourning, essentially. Enter into a position of mourning is what they had her do. Like in anticipation of confession of the sin and perhaps her demise if she doesn't come out of this. But it's a really odd test,
The story about Solomon and Bathsheba, since her husband was out at the front when they got together, but the baby died. Does that tie in any way? Is that sort of a...
You mean David and Bathsheba? No, I don't see a tie-in with that. But
like being a curse if it's...
Yeah. I don't know, don't know that. I mean, I understand the observation, but I don't know if there's any connection or not. I'm not aware of this thing ever being referred to again other than that chapter. So having said that, let's move on. But it is a very unusual test. Now, chapter 6 involves the rules concerning a Nazarite vow. A lot of people that are not familiar with the term Nazarite and Nazarene assume that Jesus was a Nazarite. He was not a Nazarite. He was from Nazareth and a Nazarene. A Nazarite was a word that means dedicated to the Lord. And so this Nazarite vow was a whole different deal. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, chapter 6, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of dedication to the Lord as a Nazarite, they must abstain from wine and other fermented drink. They must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. They must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. It seems like an odd prohibition in a culture where the water was suspect and almost everybody drank wine every meal. As long as they remain under their Nazarite vow, they must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or skins. During the entire period of their Nazarite vow, no razor may be used on their head. They must be holy until the period of their dedication to the Lord is over. They must let their hair grow long, and throughout the period of their dedication to the Lord, the Nazarite must not go near a dead body. And so this was the initial text, and the references for the offerings that they had to give and so forth come later. But notice this is a personal choice. If anybody wants to do this, they can do it, is what it says. If anyone wants to, it says a man or a woman wants to make a special vow. So a man or a woman could be a Nazarite. They could take a Nazarite vow. Over time, there developed within Judaism an oral tradition related to the Nazarite vow that contained these regulations with some details, further details. And the regulations involved a permanent Nazarite vow versus a short-term Nazarite vow. This is alluding to a short-term vow. Would you agree? It says for the portion of the vow and so forth. But there are several examples of lifetime Nazarites, Samson being the first one, of course, that comes to mind. So these guidelines were well established by the first century when Jesus was on the earth. The guidelines for a Nazarite vow. This was a common thing to do. And so the first aspect was, number one, the vow must be recorded by a priest and be accompanied by specific offerings. This was taken both from the text and from the oral tradition that developed. The second one, they must abstain from drinking wine, grape products, or any strong liquor. That's actually within this text of Numbers 6. They must stop shaving their heads or cutting their hair. And I didn't mention, by the way, at the start of the vow, you shave your head. So you start off with a shaved face and head. And culturally, they had beards. It's like Muslims in our generation. You expect to see a Muslim, an observant Muslim with a full beard. They stopped shaving their heads or cutting their hair. For lifetime vow, they could cut their hair once a year. Now that'll become important in a minute. In verse 4, they abstained from defiling themselves by touching the dead. I'm so sorry about this cough. Anybody watching online, I'm sorry about the cough. I can't help the microphone sound. Okay. They must abstain from defiling themselves by touching the dead. Now, certain scholars believe that this just means dead human bodies. Some scholars, Jewish and Christian scholars alike, believe that this meant they had to be vegetarians, no meat of any kind. So touching dead bodies, if it's just for, and this is not clearly spelled out in the text. And so depending on which source you use, you'll see this both ways. So the abstention from defiling themselves by touching the dead, it really depends on who's making the rules, on whether you got to be a vegetarian for your short-term Nazarite vow, or it only refers to touching human bodies. The typical short-term vow was for 30 days. These were registered, at the time of Jesus, these were registered in the temple.
You would go in and make a 30-day vow. They'd cut your hair as evidence of starting the vow. You'd pay the offering fee, and then you would officially be entered into this vow. A lot of scholars believe that that's what Paul did in Acts chapter 21, that he had gone in and he was both taking a Nazarite vow and paying the fee for himself and for others for the Nazarite vow. I've got the reference down there. Samson, of course, was a well-known Nazarite, as was Samuel. Samuel's mother and Samson's mother and father made them Nazarites, which is a little different from the vow we just read. It's voluntary. They had the same prohibitions, as far as the dietary restrictions, no alcohol and so forth, but they didn't choose it for themselves. Their parents chose it for them. So they're a little unique in this respect. It's believed that Absalom may have taken one. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26 refers to the fact that Absalom cut his hair once a year. That became part of Judaism, that if you were a lifetime Nazarite, you could cut your hair once a year. And I'm not aware of any references to Absalom drinking alcohol. Not directly referenced that he didn't, but no specific, Absalom was having a few with his buddies. And then John the Baptist, this is all theological stuff. John the Baptist is also believed to have taken either a Nazarite vow or continued on from the admonition that his mother and father were given before his birth, that he was not to drink alcohol. And so these are some well-known ones. The fact that Paul may have taken one fascinates me because it's after the cross. Paul was doing stuff in the temple when he was arrested. This whole area fascinates me because the early apostles, Paul included as an apostle, felt at liberty to continue in the temple system while it functioned. It functioned until 70 AD. And so as long as they were able, remember John and Peter were arrested on the day of prayer or at the hour of prayer in the temple. They were in the temple praying when they healed the lame man, and he caused a big fuss. And so Paul in Acts chapter 21 apparently says that he's there taking some kind of vow, paying some kind of fee. It mentions the hair cutting and so forth, the shaving of the head. So Paul may have taken one. That fascinates me. Like for some reason, after Jesus, after the cross, Paul felt not only at liberty, but led to do this. You follow what I'm saying? Like if this is an old trapping that's no longer applicable, why on earth would Paul do this? But it was according to number 6, it was to dedicate yourself to the Lord for a season of time. And so in Paul's case, he may have been trying to validate the fact he was still a Jew, because if you recall, the accusation was that he was no longer Jewish, and was spreading heresy about Judaism. Or it may have been more than that. Maybe he saw some benefit in it. Now, the last thing in number 6, the most famous blessing in the Bible is in Numbers chapter 6. If we did nothing else tonight other than this, there are 2 verses that should be memory verses to everybody, that if you ever memorize any verses, you ought to memorize these verses, because they're blessings from the Lord. And so in verse 22 is not one of them, but it leads up to, the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, and then verse 24 and 25 are the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Now, I'm not going to make you repeat after me, but if you ever want to memorize anything, those are good things to memorize. You want to memorize the blessings. And they give you peace. That word is shalom, by the way, that last word. So it's more than just you're relaxed. It has a lot of implications to it. So this priestly blessing, when we were in Leviticus, we read previously that the priest was to bless in this manner. Everybody look this way. Remember, the priest was to raise his hands toward the people when he was pronouncing a blessing. And so this priestly blessing was pronounced this way. And then over time, they started separating their hands like this to represent the letter Shin. The letter Shin is from Shaddai. Shaddai. So it's one of the names of God. So they would use symbolically their hands like this, like the Lord, Shaddai. They wouldn't say Yahweh, but to imply Shaddai is blessing you. We say God Shaddai, El Shaddai. And so this
This would be this way. By the way, has anybody ever seen this before?
Yes.
And where'd you see it? Star Trek. That's right. Spock was Jewish. Spock was Jewish. And so this is still used in some synagogue settings.
He actually chose it for that reason.
Okay. So anyway, so the priest or the high priest, whoever's giving the blessing, would do it this way. And then the people receiving the blessing lift up your hands. You didn't have to replicate the finger posture, but you would receive the blessing from El Shaddai. And so the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. And so the impartation comes from heaven. The words are spoken here. The impartation comes from heaven. That's a really excellent blessing. There's no better in the Bible. You know, you'll hear the term benediction in services. A lot of times they'll choose something from the New Testament, which is fine, but there's none better than that one. Chapter 7. This is a very, very repetitive chapter. It fascinates me because I'm a geek. I already told you that on the numbers. But the offerings, the 12 tribes made 12 exact representations, offerings for the tabernacle, for the work of the tabernacle and the paying of the 8,500 priests and so forth. Verse 2, the leaders of Israel, the heads of families who were tribal leaders in charge of those who were counted, made offerings. They brought as their gifts before the Lord 6 covered carts and 12 oxen, an ox from each leader and a cart from every 2. These they presented before the tabernacle. The Lord said to Moses, accept these from them so that they may be used in the work at the tent of meeting. Give them to the Levites as each man's work requires. And then the first offering is brought by Judah. It's listed there. And then exactly the same offering is repeated for each of the tribes. Okay, so I don't have all those texts. But the combined total of everything is also listed. And so verse 84, it's a long chapter, by the way, 89 verses. But verse 84, these were the offerings of the Israelite leaders for the dedication of the altar when it was anointed. 12 silver plates, 12 sprinkling bowls, and 12 gold dishes. And then it gives the weight of each of those individual implements, which is fascinating to me. And then verse 87, the total number of animals for the burnt offering came to 12 young bulls, 12 rams, and 12 male lambs a year old, together with their grain offering. 12 male goats were used for sin offering. In verse 88, the total number of animals for the sacrifice of the fellowship offering came to 24 oxen, 60 rams, 60 male goats, 60 male lambs a year old. These were the offerings. Now, the specificity, again, it fascinates me because in some ways it's superfluous. In other ways, it's contemporary evidence that these notes were taken in real time when all this stuff was unfolding we're reading about in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. You follow? To have this level of specificity, these were, if we were all to go to court tomorrow and you had notes on what transpired here 6 months ago, if you had notes that you took the night of the event, those notes would carry more weight than if you tried to reconstruct with no notes. You follow? Notes that are taken contemporary to the events carry more weight in a court of law. Here we have specificity on the animals, the plates, the bowls, the dishes, to the point of how much they weighed individually. Who records that? You know, and so when I said that the book of Numbers is a historical narrative, this really is a historical narrative with great detail and specificity. Verse 89. Now, this is one of my pet peeve verses. Verse 89 of chapter 7 should be verse 1 of chapter 8. I know you'll probably get tired of me saying this, but the numbering system for the chapters and verses are arbitrary. They're not in the text. They were done roughly 450 years ago, and they were not, in my opinion, anointed and correct in several locations. This is one of the places where it's just a weird verse attached to the last chapter. When Moses entered the tent of meeting, verse 89, when Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from between the 2 cherubim above the atonement cover on the ark of the covenant law. In this way, the Lord spoke to him. And then it goes on to say what he said in the next chapter, which is very bizarre. You know, forgive me. Chapter 8, And so in chapter 8, this is what he said. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, speak to Aaron and say to him, when you set up the lamps and see that all 7 lamps in the area light up in the area in front of the lampstand. Aaron did so. He set up the lamps so that they face forward on the lampstand, just as the Lord commanded Moses. This is how the lampstand was made. It was made of hammered gold from its base to its blossoms. The lampstand was made exactly like the pattern the Lord had showed Moses. Again, this thing was heavy. The menorah was big and it was heavy. It was roughly the size of that doorway there from top to bottom. Yeah, it was a big thing. This wasn't a little table article. Verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, take the Levites from among all the Israelites, make them ceremonially clean. To purify them, do this. Sprinkle the water of cleansing on them, then have them shave their whole bodies and wash their clothes, and so they'll purify themselves. So this purification ritual involved ceremonial washing, which later developed into mikvahs. Hands were then laid on the priest by the assembled Israelites, not just by other priests. You know, in church ordinations, the ordained ordained the ordained. But in Israel, the general assembly laid hands on the priest. Verse 9, bring the Levites to the front of the tent of meeting and assemble the whole Israelite community. You're to bring the Levites before the Lord, and the Israelites are to lay their hands on them. And this idea of you're my representative with the laying on of hands. They are the Lord's in substitution for Israel's firstborn. This is replicated again. I've taken the Levites as my own in place of the firstborn. And then verse 23, the Lord said to Moses, this applies to the Levites, men 25 years old or more shall come to take part at the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50, they must retire from their regular service and work no longer. They may assist their brothers in performing their duties, so reference to the semi-retirement. And an early reference to the 25. Some believe that was added after David changed the number, but who knows. Chapter 9. This is a second national Passover celebration. The first one was when they were leaving Egypt. And so this lets you know that we're just a year into this thing since they've been delivered from Egypt. And so in Exodus 40, the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year. In Numbers chapter 1, the second month of the second year is the start of Numbers chapter 1. And so we're going to be in chapter 9 now, going back to the first month of the second year. How does that happen? Chapter 9 is not in chronological order with what preceded it. Everybody see those references? I know it's a little confusing, but the first month of the second year is Numbers chapter 9, verse 1. First month of the second year. Numbers chapters 1, verse 1 is the second month of the second year. See the discrepancy between the two. So apparently the words that were given in chapter 9 happened roughly the same time the tabernacle was set up early on. They're still camped in the same location. We know that for a fact. So when this was written down, it was the same period of time, all within 1 year, but different chronologically from chapter 1. Sorry about the nuance on that. Verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of Egypt. He said, have the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time. Celebrate it at the appointed time at twilight on the 14th day of this month, in accordance with all of its rules and regulations. So Moses told the Israelites to celebrate the Passover. And they did so in the desert of Sinai at twilight on the 14th day of the month. And so the official day was the 14th of the month. But if you were unable to celebrate it on the correct month, there was a workaround, and this is included here. This is still practiced to this day. So in verse 6, what am I hearing? Oh, it's you. He's got an electric devil over there working him. It was tenacious, whatever it was.
It usually is.
So, if you were not ceremonially eligible to take the Passover on the appointed day, the following text applied. Verse 6,
Some of them could not celebrate Passover on the day because they were ceremonially unclean on account of a dead body or something else later. So they came to Moses and Aaron that same day and said to Moses, "We've become unclean because of a dead body. But why should we be kept from presenting the Lord's offering with the other Israelites at the appointed time?" Verse 10, the Lord said, "Tell the Israelites, when any of you or your descendants are unclean because of a dead body or are away on a journey, they're still to celebrate the Lord's Passover, but they're to do it on the 14th day of the second month at twilight." And so this was a inclusive workaround. I think that's kind of fascinating. And then a reference to the pillar of fire and the cloud that guided Israel. This is the last thing we'll cover, and then we'll take some questions. But on the verse 15, on the day the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law, was set up, Exodus chapter 40, verse 17, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud of the tabernacle looked like fire. That's how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days at the Lord's command. They would encamp, and then at his command they'd set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning. When it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's commands. And so what's going on here? There's a constant, present, daily, nightly manifestation of the supernatural reality of God for these people for 40 years. There's nothing that parallels this in the world's history, with 3 million witnesses. When this was written, it was still happening, or the group that had watched it happen were the recipients of the text. This happened every day, every night for 40 years, continually. And so what does it say to us? When the cloud was still, they were still. When the cloud moved, they would move out. And they had to be ready even if it was in the night. So the first thing, it was symbolic of being led by the Spirit. You know, the Lord was obviously leading them somewhere, being led by the Spirit, waiting on the Spirit, waiting on the leading of the Spirit. And this idea of getting attuned to the leading of the Lord is incorporated prophetically into the text. And then the aspect of being ready at a moment's notice. Whether it was day or night, when that cloud moved, they go. And so when they were very sensitive, they got the training. You know, prophetically, it's telling us, you know, be ready for the leading of the Lord. Whether it's day or night, be ready and be sensitive and attuned to the leading of the Lord. We probably don't get the pillar and the cloud, the pillar of fire and the cloud, but I don't know anybody who gets that, but maybe you do. But we do get led by the Spirit, and we have to be sensitive to the leading of the Spirit. Romans says that those that are led by the Spirit are the sons of God. So one of the hallmarks of genuinely being born again is being led by the Spirit. And this is an early prophetic prototype, symbolic. All right, questions? Yes, sir. I could take a breath now and eat a mint.
When you were reading off all of the sacrifice offerings, the oxen, the rams, the goats, lambs, etc., I started thinking to myself, okay, to do the sacrifice of an animal is not a quick thing.
So you're on chapter 7,
This is
verse 84 and following is what you're talking about. Okay.
bottom line, was there somebody designated to take care of the animals before they were sacrificed?
The organization of all this was a bloody mess, you know. And have you ever been around animals that are slaughtered? I have. Certain animals have an awareness of what's going on. Some of them are oblivious. But certain animals, once they catch on what's going on, they start smelling the blood and stuff, they're not willingly hanging around.
And so it took some serious effort, to get this thing accomplished. And when you read, someone said a long time ago, Judaism and by extension Christianity are bloody religions, because the blood is so integral. This is a very messy deal, So yeah, there had to be people involved in wrangling all that.
But there wasn't any specific assigned.
I don't know of a text that says you're in charge of the mule wrangling and the sheep wrangling and so forth. But obviously, it was incorporated into the system somehow.
Whoever's there grabs one.
Yeah.
I think it would be the priest, because the priest.
I'm assuming the priest, some of the priests were probably doing it, when they weren't toting the tin around.
Figure out how to move this huge.
No, I'm assuming it's Levites too, in to your point. But I don't know of specific designations. You're the horse keeper and you're that kind of thing.
It would be my thought they would be Levites, which surprises me that it wouldn't be specifically mentioned as being something that was
Okay.
important. But anyway, as far as the Nazarite
Yes.
obligation, is there any sort of a age limitation that you know of?
I don't know of
For
any.
instance, could-
I don't know of any. There's some people that believe that on the short-term Nazarite vow, there was also a prohibition against marital intimacy. Remember when Paul said that if you take a vow to abstain from sex in a married couple, let it be for a specific period of time and it has to be agreed to by both parties? Some believe he was alluding to a Nazarite vow with that, but I don't know that one for a fact. And the Nazarite vow seems to somehow have implications for governmental anointing. And by that I mean Samson was a judge over the whole country. Samuel was a judge over the whole country. Absalom could have been the king of Israel if his heart had been right after David. We don't know. But he was certainly in the royal lineage. John the Baptist was the governmental leadoff of the Old Testament, or the finale of the Old Testament. He was the one that introduced the Messiah to planet Earth and so forth. So governmentally, he was the voice of the kingdom, so to speak. So there are implications in terms of what it was for. If you look at the characters that got it, Paul, of course, was, in my opinion, the preeminent apostle, among those in the first century in terms of his influence. Obviously, government of the kingdom of God again. So what was the point of Nazarite vow? Specifically to dedicate yourself to the Lord more fully. That was the idea.
It was specifically for yourself. Like, for instance, your parents could.
Like I tell you, the exceptions were Samuel and Samson, and to some degree, John the Baptist. Their parents were told to do it. Samuel's mother did it voluntarily. Samson's mother and father were told by an angel, that he wasn't to drink or to cut his hair and so forth. The parents of John the Baptist were told he wasn't to drink. His hair's not mentioned. But it's assumed that it was part of the package of a Nazarite. So yeah, those are exceptions. The Lord dictated they were dedicated from the outset. But the one we just read from Numbers is voluntary. Yes, ma'am.
This was so explicit on exactly what to do and, naming every move and jot and tittle and all of that. How on earth did we come to today where people, just kind of guess, well, maybe if we worship a little louder for another hour, then, the Lord is going to break out or something. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. Let me answer that this way. The Lord laid down a system He was laying down a couple of different things at the same time. This is how you operate, live together, work together, survive together, camp together, move together, etc. That was part of it. The religious part of it was, if you want to approach me, this is the way I'm willing to be approached. And it was not a simple protocol.
to approach the Lord. It wasn't. In the New Testament, it's made clear that there was nothing wrong with the rules and regulations the Lord set down, but nobody could do them. And so the problem was not with the rules, the problem was with humanity. And so the answer for that problem was Jesus, who was able to fulfill everything perfectly. But the protocols, there was nothing wrong with the protocols, Some of them were difficult to understand. That business about the woman with the swelling stomach and miscarrying and all that from the dust of the temple and water, that's bitter. That's very strange. That's not the only one. The Azazel goat thing is very strange. It's pointed to him because he likes the Azazel goat. That's the scapegoat. Okay.
I'm surprised that the priesthood classes divided up into the different philosophies of interpretation
Later.
of the law.
Later. So let me close in prayer, and then we'll sign off on the website, on the webcast. Okay, what's your question?
You may know it, you may not, I can always look it up. Do you know how much shekel is equivalent to in our nations?
I do not know what currently Israeli shekels are roughly 4 to the dollar, but I don't know what a biblical shekel is equivalent to. They use shekels today.
Oh, it's not necessarily a weight then.
Well, at that time it was. At that time it was, yeah. But I don't know what the weight would be.
So would it have been a weight of the coin? Or?
Yeah, but I don't know. That's exactly. Yeah. So let me pray, and then we'll close and let the web people go home. So, Lord, we bless you and bless those watching on the internet. And thank you, God, for those that are here. And thank you for getting me through this with a voice functioning intact. Thank you for your grace. Lord, I pray that we'd all be led by the Spirit. We love hearing about the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, God. And I, for one, want to see that. But more than that, I want to be obedient to the leading of the Holy Spirit. So, God, make us sensitive. Make your will clear to us. Give us the grace to obey, to follow where you live, or where you lead, rather, and to be ready in season or out of season for when you move. Help us, God, to stay put wherever we're planted